Thank you for having us here. We're really just thrilled to be here and be able to share a little bit of what we do at Fathom and what we call our AI assurance or AI assurance ecosystem. So we don't have to go through our introductions anymore because of Hale's lovely introduction. So I'm going to just get us kicked off and provide a brief overview of what Fathom is, what we do, and the work that we're focused on. So Fathom, we are an independent 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is really to find, build, and scale innovative solutions to help society navigate and transition into a world that's driven by AI. We were founded in the summer of 2024, and in our earlier phases, we really focused on listening and learning. And so we ran national polling, we conducted statewide focus groups, and we convened leaders from all parts of society, from business to academia to civil society, policymakers and regulators, and technologists. And we did that because we were really intentional on bringing people together who don't normally sit, at the same table together, so that we could have opportunities to engage in conversation directly and with us, and to break down silos, cross-pollinate knowledge, and to share meaningful ideas. And our executive team at that time had a goal of 100 conversations in 100 days. And what that actually turned out to be was more like 300 conversations in like 70 days. And what surfaced and became really clear through all of those conversations was that AI was advancing really quickly. The infrastructure for trust, for accountability, for oversight was not keeping pace. And I think most importantly, no single institution or point solution was going to be able to solve this on its own. And so that insight really led us to our first major initiative, which is this framework for an independent oversight marketplace for AI that was designed to be able to keep at the pace of innovation, to be able to bring in the technical expertise, the subject matter experts that are needed to really effectively implement AI governance, and to create the incentives that are needed to make this ecosystem self-sustaining and to be able to reliably scale responsible AI. And so today, our work really spans across two major components that are distinct but related. So, and across two major teams. And so we have a policy team, and they work on advancing legislation that's based on this independent oversight marketplace framework. And then we have an impact team, which is where Graeme and I both sit, and we focus on building and activating the AI assurance ecosystem, which is really the actors, the participants that would engage and populate this marketplace. So in the next two slides, we have a short video that was produced by our policy team to show, to kind of bring the framework to life. And then after that, Graeme and I will do a little bit of a deeper dive on what we mean by AI assurance ecosystem. But first, before we show you the video, I wanted to just briefly ground our work in the broader context and what is the problem that we are trying to solve here, right? And so there's a real trust gap across our society that really spans businesses, it spans government, it spans the public. And what we kind of surfaced in those conversations that we had early on is now really broadly reflected in market research data. And so the data that we're seeing shows that most Americans don't trust companies to self-regulate their use of AI. I'm sure everyone in this room and our audience online have heard of we don't want big tech to grade their own homework. At the same time, there's limited confidence that our lawmakers, our policymakers can properly regulate AI, usually cited as a lack of the technical expertise that's needed, and also our legislative process, by design is just too slow for a technology like AI. And then at the same time, there is strong demand for more guardrails, around, primarily child safety, privacy, misinformation, oversight, but no real mechanisms have really bubbled to the surface to ensure for these guardrails. And I think really notable is that this trust gap is not just a part of, we're not seeing this just in the public. Companies and organizations and enterprise AI deployers are also really struggling and grappling with this trust gap as well. There is data that shows the trust concerns are materially slowing down the adoption of AI technology and materially delaying deployment. So the amount of time that it takes to bringing in a technology from pilot phase and then putting it into production, concerns with reliability, trustworthiness, security, all of those things are extending that timeline. And so we at Fathom, we believe that AI is going to be massively transformative across our economy, for our society. But in order for us to really be able to harness its value and its benefits, we're going to need some solutions that address and bridge this gap. And so now in the next slide, we're going to play a video from our policy team that shows the legislative approach that Fathom is taking to try to tackle this trust.
AI is everywhere now, whether we know it or not. How do I know I can trust you to be safe?
Everyday AI is increasingly transforming how we work and live, and people want reasonable guardrails.
Whoa.
A way to make AI both safe and innovative. And that's why there's a solution gaining momentum.
What's that?
An independent oversight marketplace for AI. And here is how it works. First, state legislatures pass legislation authorizing this framework.
We vote yes.
Which spurs a new marketplace of innovative technical bodies called Independent Verification Organizations, or IVOs. These IVOs are made up of subject matter experts who are independent from industry and required to be transparent to society.
We're on it.
These expert evaluators design the tools, technical criteria, and procedures for verifying the safety and security of AI products, creating a marketplace designed to innovate solutions that lead to greater trust and accountability in AI systems.
Get your verification here.
The government's role is to set goals related to safe and responsible AI for its citizens, and then to hold IVOs accountable for showing that verification does lead to safer outcomes, or else they risk losing their license.
We're watching.
For example, it's unacceptable for AI models to encourage users to commit self-harm. Licensed IVOs then develop and test technical criteria to determine whether an AI product meets those goals. And because technology moves fast, IVOs are responsible for keeping pace with rapidly evolving capabilities, regularly updating their testing criteria and verifying AI products on an ongoing basis. AI companies that meet the criteria earn verification, a signal to users that their AI is trustworthy.
I think I'll go with this one.
Verification is completely voluntary, but those companies who get verified can gain a powerful signal of trust that sets them apart, as well as risk mitigation benefits and legal clarity.
Sign me up.
Safety and trust become competitive advantages. It's a race to the top. In the absence of federal action, this framework can scale from the state to the national level, creating a constellation of interoperable state markets while avoiding a harmful patchwork of conflicting regulations. An independent oversight marketplace for AI helps us harness this technology's power while building the trust we need to create a better AI future for all.
Let's do it.
Amazing. Okay, so that is the framework, the Independent Oversight Marketplace framework that our policy legislation is built on. So government sets the outcomes. It also licenses third-party technical experts to be able to verify to ensure that AI applications, systems, models can actually meet those outcomes, and at the same time, it creates a competitive advantage for AI developers to want to get their products verified and get that certification mark.
I'm just wondering what states you folks are currently working with that are maybe more
pro IVOs and creating some level of like kind of protective legislation?
Yeah.
Just
Do we? Yeah, so we have legislation running in Ohio, Florida, Virginia. Our bill actually just came out of committee in Virginia as a study bill. So we're seeing really good traction so far with the state's responsiveness right now. And we have probably a handful more that are going through the process. Yeah, yeah.
So in your framework, where would the funding for these IVOs come from? I assume it can't be coming from the companies directly paying for the services.
Okay, so the question is, where does the funding for these IVOs come from? It probably can't be. There's probably conflicts of interest if it's coming from, I guess, AI developers. Yeah. So actually the funding so IVO is kind of the legislative name for what we call basically independent AI assurance providers, right? And right now there's actually already, it's an emerging ecosystem of, I don't want to give an exact number because, it's dozens and dozens and dozens of organizations like this. And they range from for-profit to nonprofit to labs. And so what we want to create is really a private marketplace for this. So some of the funding comes from philanthropic funding. Some of these AI assurance providers actually have viable products for, they're for-profit, they're viable products for the market. And so one of the things that I do is I work with what we call enterprise AI deployers, right? And they generate the demand signal to say, okay, I want, before I buy this AI system from an AI developer, I need this to get the verification and the trust check mark for that. So the funding kind of comes from all over the place, but I recognize that sometimes you follow the money and there can be conflicts of interest. And so there are kind of professional codes of ethics and how do we define what independence actually means. Yeah. Yes.
Maybe I'm thinking about this a bit too hard, but there are a couple of things that stood out to me as maybe problematic.
Okay.
Just to start on, if you're doing this at the level of state legislatures, what happens if the IVOs for one state say yes, another state no? For another, who's checking over the tools that these IVOs are using? If they can, if there's a sufficient, the uncomfortably close public-private partnership here, it's impossible that the inappropriate validation of unfit procedures for those IVOs. I think I had another question about actual independence, but I think you answered that one for Aaron.
Okay, and sorry, what was I feel like there's a couple of questions in there. What was the first one? Can you repeat the first one?
You have a bunch of state legislators.
Okay.
Near California, I'm sure. Each have their own set of IVOs, and all these companies. Oh, right. I remember the third thing, but I'll get to that. Anyway, they each have these IVOs. New York says, yeah, company A is great, they seem fine. California is saying, actually, we have some problems here. What happens then? And then for the last thing, this is a private marketplace, then aren't we going to wind up with corner cutting among these IPOs?
Okay, so the first one, which is basically, do you end up with a patchwork, right, of different IVOs? And the way that the system's designed is that we're hoping that this is actually interoperable, right? And so if New York does say that, okay, I'm gonna, this IVO fits all of this licensing criteria, then we're going to authorize you to be an official IVO. Then we're hoping that California sees the same thing, and the system is designed so that it can actually work across jurisdictions and across states. I would say if there is conflicting, licensing requirements, right? The system is actually designed to be voluntary and with, at least initially. And I don't know, Andrew, I don't know if you want to tackle. And I'm just going to caveat that Graeme and I do not sit on the policy team. So this is me putting on my policy hat right now. So.
I think the one thing that I would offer just as I think you got to separate The government's role in this model is setting outcomes, right? It's not actually conducting the testing. So it is entirely possible you could have inconsistent outcomes, right? You could have one state saying this is what good looks like, and another state saying this is what good looks like, and they don't necessarily match, and that's state government, right? States have the flexibility to do that. But the thing to remember is this is not a unique sort of environment. There are multiple other types of industries where this kind of model exists, and you tend to come to a norm nationally just because, you know, what good looks like generally is relatively common, right, across the nation, and there's a sort of a commercial incentive, right, to get to sort of a common standard. There is a different question in terms of what if you had, like there's competency questions in terms of the ability of a certain organization to do the examination, right, and the licensing, and that's where I think there's the bar for entry becomes important, and how you actually test qualifications and competencies to be an IVO. And that's sort of, to be honest, part of what our role is in trying to set this legislation is to establish a bar that's high enough that you don't get into those kinds of issues. But it's not something you can really just sort of set it and forget it. It's something that's going to require constant monitoring to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen.
Absolutely, but it also doesn't seem like it's necessarily linearly orderable. I mean, it's not like there is some absolute like range. Maybe one state says, actually, evals are extremely important to us, and another one says, well, we'd really rather use the tutor. And there's not really a clear way to say that one is better than the other.
That is true, but I think that's inherent, if you like, the state government structure, right? That we allow that kind of, you know, absent like a national federal standard, the states are encouraged in effect to experiment in that way and have their own points of view, and that's just, it's inherent to the model we have in the United States.
All right, great. Thank you, Graham.
All right.
All right, I think you're up.
I'm on now? Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask you to do the slide pushes
sure.
because I don't want to press the wrong button. So morning, everyone. Again, my name is Graeme Finley. I focus on the AI assurance ecosystem and effectively trying to build a scalable profession around AI assurance, and we'll try and define a little bit more about what that is. And we think about it in sort of two main areas. So think about it like nouns and verbs, right? So what are the organizations involved in AI assurance, and then what are the activities that we would label as AI assurance? Because it's not really a well-defined term, and a bunch of people have their own sort of perspectives on what it is. So we'll talk about an organizational level viewpoint to start with. So if you want to go to the next slide. So this is a very sort of simple representation of how we think about AI assurance in terms of the organizational actors involved. So we'll go around the circle, right? Developers. So these are organizations who develop AI software, and it could be model developers, or it could be organizations that develop software systems that have AI embedded within them. But generally, in either case, they're software that is for sale to a third party in some sense, right? Then we have deployers, and these are the organizations that Jamie was representing earlier. These are organizations that are actually using AI. They're deploying AI within their organizations. Sometimes they're building it themselves, but a lot of the times they're basically purchasing AI-enabled systems, whether directly at the model level or, you know, third-party commercial systems from a developer, and then they are deploying it inside their organizations. And, you know, as Jamie said, there's a trust issue there in that the deployers themselves don't necessarily trust that the software is going to be accurate and reliable. And so they are a significant demand driver for assurance as an activity. We have insurers as a major actor in this. In general, if you are a software developer, you want or are required to have warranty coverage on your product and generally some kind of liability insurance too. I don't know how much you follow the insurance marketplace, but that's been a real challenge for insurers because they require actuarial data on incidents and economic harms and how do they have to do the math, right, in terms of how to charge a premium. And it's very difficult for AI because it's so new. And so some of them have simply responded by putting exclusions where we're simply not going to cover AI, which is a major issue, right, if you're a developer or a deployer. So there's a lot of work going on in the insurance industry right now to try and figure out how do we actually insure AI, right? And assurance of AI is one of those key areas. So in the middle area, we have what we're calling AI assurance providers. All right, and we'll talk a bit more about what that means in a moment. But these are organizations that conduct assurance activities, and they may work for an insurer, for a deployer, a developer, or for a deployer, or some combination of all three, to conduct an assurance activity around an AI entity. Right? On the bottom side, we have a series of organizations that influence this activity. We got this general catch-all term for authority. So that can be a government entity that sort of sets, it's like the IVO model. Like the government, a state government would be an authority that establishes requirements and provides licenses. But it can also be standard-setting bodies like ISO, right? NIST. They are authorities, right? They set and they credit. And if you think about other professions, like the accounting profession, for example, there are bodies that actually certify individuals and organizations to be licensed practitioners of this, right? And that's something we do not have really today in the AI assurance world. And then we have advisors and overseers from both a civil society perspective, so people thinking about the broader societal impact for AI, how we, ensuring that AI happens for the benefit of humanity. And then academia and research advancing the state of the art of how to do assurance, because this is a technically evolving and technically complex area. Where even the tools and methods and techniques are still very much under development. And, we all know the field is advancing faster than we can keep up. And so this is an important role to make sure that the assurance providers have the tools and techniques they need to be effectively able to assure the software. So this is sort of the, very simple organizational view of the actors involved in the assurance landscape. Now, if we go to, okay, what do we mean by the actual work? We think about it in a sort of a two-dimensional frame, and I'm not going to sort of drain the details of the slide, but just to sort of get the concept of it. Think about it in terms of there's the what we think of as assurance objects. What are the entities that are having assurance done to them? And so that's the columns across the top. And then what are the outcomes that you're trying to assure? And those are the rows down the left-hand side. So I'll just sort of go through them quickly. And it's really sort of it's a layered, sort of a layer cake in a way. On the object side, start with organizational. This is entity level assessment. So it could be, the entity could be a model developer, like an OpenAI, or it could be a company that's deploying AI, and you want to do assurance activities at that organizational level. And to be honest, this is where most of the activity in terms of defined standards and frameworks has really been applied to date. ISO 42001, NIST AI Risk Management Framework, they're really organizational control level, standards and frameworks. How do you do governance? How do you do risk management? Things like whistleblower protections, like organizational level stuff, right? Second is the model level. So it's an actual, like a GPT-5, an actual model where you're doing, whether it's capability or safety assessments at the individual model level. The third is system level. So this is you take a model and you wrap it with a bunch of other scaffolding to make a system, which maybe in many cases a commercially, sellable entity. So let's say it's a Workday or somebody like that that's taking an AI model and it's wrapping it as part of their own software and then selling it on to customers. The fourth level is a deployed solution. So this is a system in an actual organizational context. So it's a particular organization is deploying an AI system with their data, their users, their customers, their interfaces, and all of the context that goes around that. And then the final area is probably the most emergent one, is networks of agents, particularly where they are interacting across organizational boundaries. So you have multiple agents that maybe are operating for different organizations, and they are communicating and acting in a semi-autonomous way to affect some transaction. Right? It might be a payment system with a bank, with a retail entity, and they're all coordinating together. Right? So those are sort of the layers that we're thinking about in terms of what is being assured. And then on the rows, these are the outcomes that we're trying to assure. So there's governance. So this is really about decision making. A lot of the process stuff is here in terms of how do we think about risk? How do we decide who gets to sort of make decisions about things? Safety. A lot of that is your traditional sort of loss of control, misalignment type safety work. Security. obviously is sort of relatively self-explanatory in thinking about security implications associated with all of these. Data and privacy, so this is both what kind of data are you using, what's your data lineage, thinking about the privacy of that data, who gets access to it, what kind of control, IP rights would sort of fall under this kind of thing. Reliability, so this is one we're really spending a lot of time thinking about. So reliability as distinct from accuracy. There's, I think we've been very influenced by it. There's a paper that came out from a team at Princeton recently about an emerging science of AI reliability, and they make a really good point that when you think about benchmark scores, they're really accuracy scores. How good are these models at giving you a right answer? What they don't talk about is things like consistency and predictability and failure modes. Right? So when it goes wrong, how badly does it go wrong? Does it degrade gracefully or does it degrade catastrophically? And that matters a lot if you're using this in a production environment. So think about an AI embedded in the utility system or something that's making clinical recommendations in an ER situation. You care a lot about how badly it goes wrong if it goes wrong, and does it give you the same answer every single time? Right, so those reliability aspects are very, very important from an operational deployment perspective, and it's been a lot less studied until recently. And then the final area, sort of a catch-all term, but impact, and this is really where you're getting to the human impact associated with the deployment of the AI solution at whatever level. So this is where you have things such as equity of outcomes, sort of bias, fairness. It also includes things like societal implications, human AI interaction, and it could be at a model level. You're talking about sort of broader, user bases. Think about the child safety types of conversations. At an organizational level, you think about a deployed solution inside a company. It's like, how do your employees interact with that? How well trained are they in terms of embedding that in their business processes? What's the customer interaction? How are the customers feeling in terms of their interaction with that? What are the sort of brand and reputational impacts associated with addressing AI? So all of those are things that we want to think about assurance across, all of these different levels. And as you can see, it's a pretty broad set of categories, and we're doing that deliberately to sort of set a wide tent, if you like, because what we're trying to do is understand assurance as a field and a discipline in the broadest possible sense. And when you start to think about the products and services and organizations that are involved in this, we've got a list of maybe like 100 organizations that are involved in this activity at some level, either as software providers providing tooling to support it, or as professional services providers where they do this work in some sense. And so what we are trying to do is provide effectively a home for those people to think of themselves as all in the same field, and how do we start to create an emerging sense of a profession where collectively we are advancing a set of societal goals around AI, and we're leveraging what I talked about just before in terms of both advice from civil society organizations as well as the state of the art for the people who are really investigating, like how do you do model evaluations, how do you do multi-agent evaluations, thinking about accountability and transparency. There's some very real practical sort of consequences about how do you ensure a transaction that's got multiple agents running across multiple organizations. You need to be able to do audit trailing and sort of understand who made what decision why in order to be able to define accountability, right? And this is very much sort of state-of-the-art stuff. So we're looking to provide a home for all of these, and the one method we have to do that is to create a trade association for this field, and that's what Jamie's going to talk about.
All right, so what Graeme just walked through is a very nicely organized way of what this ecosystem looks like, who are the actors, how do they fit and stitch together. But a system like that, especially in the early days, doesn't emerge in such a structured way by default. And without coordination, parts of it may develop, but it's going to be slow, it might be uneven, and it's going to be inefficient, meaning that organizations are going to be left to really figure things out on their own. They're going to probably be recreating the wheel and doing duplicative work. And so that's one of the, the impetuses of why we're building a trade association, to provide, as Graham said, provide a home. The trade association for AI assurance, right? It can bring structure, it can bring alignment, and also importantly, it can really accelerate the development of this ecosystem, because we all know how fast AI is iterating and developing. And so the vision of our trade, of what we're doing, is really a world where AI systems are trusted enough so that it can be deployed broadly, and producing outcomes that benefit society, strengthen the economy, and really maintain the public trust. And how we're going to be doing that is really building a professional and sustainable AI assurance ecosystem, right? So all the actors that supporting all of the organizations and the components of what Graham just shared. And the role of the trade organization is to catalyze and steward this emerging field, right? By aligning all of the participants, the actors that are needed to put this into practice. So aligning the technical capabilities, right, the assurance providers, with the market incentives and the demand for these services. So working with our AI deployers, our enterprise deployers, and then passing really pragmatic policy to help drive demand. And so this slide builds upon what Graham walked through earlier. And what I wanted to show is who are the members of this trade association, right? So you can see that the core membership are the boxes highlighted in orange. So we have our deployers, our providers, and our insurers. And I'm not going to walk through each of these because Graham just did that earlier. But alongside our core membership are also our advisors, right? And specifically, academia and research. So a lot of you guys, in this room, who really ensure that the practices and the standards and the protocols that come out of our trade association are really aligned with the latest in science and technical research. And then also importantly, civil society is also going to be advisors to really hold us accountable to broader societal implications of our work. And then the last thing that wanted to share with you guys are what are the core areas of agreement of our trade association. And what these are is, you can imagine that we are bringing together lots of different entities and organizations, right? And so we've gotten these are areas of agreement that all of our members align on, and it's what's going to drive our core principles, the trade association scope, our guardrails, our red lines, where are we going to play and where are we going to sit out. And so briefly just walking through each of these. So the first one, hopefully relieved that it was an easy area of agreement, is just that an accountable, competitive, and independent AI assurance ecosystem is necessary. The second is public trust is a critical measure of success. And by trust, we mean outcomes. It produces outcomes that are verifiable and trackable. Number 3 is the AI value chain. It needs to have a shared accountability structure. If you think about, an AI chain today, from model developer all the way through to, let's say, an enterprise deploying it into production, right? There are a lot of different components to that end-to-end value system. And right now, a lot of the times, it's the person at the end of that chain, the enterprise, that's bearing the majority of that risk for upstream systems and components that they have little control over, sometimes very little visibility into. And so what this is speaking to is that the risk and the accountability really needs to be appropriately distributed across all of the entities in that end-to-end chain. And then number 4 is that we need the solutions that we build need to be right-sized to the use case, the risk level, and we can't have one-size-fits-all generic compliance that doesn't actually produce the outcomes that we desire and actually just ends up increasing friction and cost without adding value. So that takes us to the end of our presentation today in our trade association. We're actively designing the foundations right now. We're working with a small group of leading assurance providers, deployers, and civil society members. We're targeting an official launch in the summer of 2026. If any of this has been interesting to you, if you want to learn more, explore membership, or have feedback on our design process, please reach out, and we would love to continue the conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, guys. Any questions for Jamie or Graham? Online, Zoom audience?
Oh, I saw there was a half hand raised.
So I guess how are you sort of approaching like goals of like what to launch this trade organization with, or like basically, how to initially start it and grow it?
Yeah, so how we're designing the foundations of this trade association first is the core principles, right? And so we really need to align are these what does the trade association stand for, right? Like what are everything, all of the initiatives, the projects that come out of it have to come from the principles of the organization. And that's one of the things that we're designing in the next several months before our launch. And so right now we're at the step of, before we can craft the principles with our founding members, we need to get areas of alignment. Like what do we agree that this trade association needs to represent, stand for, do, and work? Yeah. And so that's the core areas of agreement. Then we get the principles from there. And then we also decide on what are the priorities of the first 6 months of this trade association. And all of this is done in conjunction with the group of assurance providers and our members that we are working with right now. Initially, we're calling it the founding cohort. And so we're very much co-designing this with them. But it comes from the core agreements. I think I stopped sharing, or I did something, so now I can't control the slideshow.
The other thing that we have some activities over the spring is to start on some initial projects that we hope to have something by launch date to communicate around, like a version 1 of a few things. So if you remember the point I was making, that most of the standards that are out there are really organizational or entity level right now. There's not a lot that's really system level. And so we're looking at that as a place where we can actually provide some value by, identifying at least a starting point for a system level standard. Like if you're like an AI system evaluation, what should you be looking at, and to give some guidance around that. Mm-hmm. And also starting to think about this whole matter of cross-organizational interaction of agents, and really putting a business lens on it more than a technical lens to start with, but just thinking about like what are even the business norms associated with agents that cross organizations. Like multiple companies are interacting in a single business process and they all have semi-autonomous agents involved. How should you be thinking about things like contract roles and consumer disclosures and things like that? And we think it's a gap right now, and we can offer something to the world as part of our launch, and here's some ideas. So I think it's sort of launching with an initial set of members. We're in active recruitment now, and then also a set of principles that we stand for, and hopefully people will agree with us. And then here's like a version 1 of some things, some products, right, that we think will be broadly useful to the assurance community, and hopefully like start a flywheel, right, where we can get more activity.
So if I could sort of follow up, I guess I'm not really familiar with like policy or this kind of ecosystems. Is there sort of an analogous trade organization from another field or something, or existing or something similar that you sort of view as like the goal or template of? There
are many, right? And I come from, I used to work for a bunch of big accounting firms, so I'm very familiar with the accounting profession, right? And there's many analogs, right, in that sense, in the sense that you have very well-defined definitions of what does good look like in terms of professional practice, right? And there are certifications at both an individual level, like you get a CPA, right, or as a an organization level, like a certified public accounting organization, right? They're state sponsored, and there's a bunch of organizations, the AICPA, the PCAAB, and so on, that exist to almost like police the auditors, like who's auditing the auditors. That whole structure exists. And there are analogs of that in almost every profession. If you look like doctors, professional engineers, it's sort of a standard model. Of course, the challenge is, like, accounting's had 200 years to sort of figure this model out. And along the way, there's been a bunch of fraud and companies have gone bust. And we sort of learn a bunch of lessons, right? So the same thing happened in transportation, right? There was a bunch of things about transportation safety, but a lot of people had to die along the way because of plane crashes and so on. What we're trying to do is bootstrap something in the order of like a year versus 100 years without all of that back stuff. And so
without something catastrophic happening.
We're trying to avoid people dying, right? And so we're taking sort of the best ideas from that, but I think trying to do it a lot faster and not letting perfect be the enemy of good, right? So I think there's a bunch of infrastructure that if we were having this conversation in 5 or 10 years' time, there'd be a lot more there in terms of like, this is how a profession runs. It's not there today. It's not going to be there in a year's time, but it doesn't mean we can't start doing things, right? We've almost got no choice, right? Because things are just moving so quickly. So we're sort of trying to sort of do it incrementally and build the things that you normally think of as a profession over time, but we know it's not going to be there at day one.
Yeah. There's another trade association, I believe it's called Zeta, that's for EVs. Electric vehicles, and emerging science. They're trying to, at the time, I want to say this was probably like 15 years ago, bolster the EV industry, and so they were reaching out to members across not just OEMs and car manufacturers, but people who created the batteries and mining the minerals and etc. So that also is an analogous trade association. From a different lens than the professional associations that Graham mentioned. But for that, it was very like a specific focus of EVs, where you can think about AI as general, broad case use. And so we're trying to take lessons learned from different trade associations, different industries, to again bootstrap this into being, so that we have a workable model in the near term than the long term, and not let perfection be the enemy of the good.
I don't think it's took a look on the internet rather than unfortunately showed up late. But are all the evaluation orgs going to be in this trade association? So like the meters and the Apollo, et cetera?
We would love for that.
Okay. Would it make sense if they were not in it? Or like, and like UKACL just does a lot of evals, but like that's like a government thing. And I don't think government's going to be involved in here. So yeah, what's the scope of who's going to be in there and who's like required to be in there?
So yeah, obviously nobody's required to be there because it's a membership organization. We would love to have as broad as representation as possible from those organizations. Just recognizing though that this is the challenge with any kind of sort of big tent concept. You try to get like a set of common principles that everybody will generally agree with, but in terms of what everybody does day to day, it's very different, right? Think about that matrix I showed, that they're focusing on different cells in the matrix, and that's okay, right? And we sort of encourage specialization, but I do think in particular those types of organizations have something really valuable to offer in terms of advancing the science, right? And I think there's an opportunity to take some of the like the capability and safety type of evaluations that they do and really bring it into the commercial world in terms of like, how do we take that and think about like reliability assessments, and when you're trying to think about addressing accountability and transparency at a use case level, right, in an organization, there's a lot that can be taken out of that. And so I think there's an ability to sort of take those sort of state-of-the-art type analyses and have them osmosis through like the rest of the practice. And so we'd love that, but obviously it's very volunteer, right? We'd love people, but nobody has to. We're trying to make enough of a case that people look at the organization like, oh, I want to be part of that, right? That's sort of our job.
And then what's the interaction with government?
So naturally, government would fall under that sort of authority lens in terms of they set a set of rules, but they can also, I think, in that sort of academia and science area in terms of advancing the state of the art. Obviously, the work that Casey or like NIST and so on, right, are doing, we'd look to collaborate and take input and advice wherever possible. We want to be careful on the, you get into some interesting conflicts of interest things depending on sort of where the government sits, right? And so from an independence perspective, we'd want, I think, the, government to be sort of an advisor, but not to be sort of a director in any sense, if that makes sense.
A couple questions online. How does the trade association compare to the work of the Frontier Model Forum?
So, interesting question. So the Frontier Model Forum, and my understanding of its operations, right? But it's really created by and is a collaboration of the Frontier model developers, right? So if we were to, it's a great organization to have, but by definition, they are not independent of the developers, right? They are sort of, created by the developers, funded by the developers. And so it's kind of organization that I think we would want to have a collaborative relationship with in terms of advancing the state of the art, how we can collaborate on doing sort of good work. But our intent is certainly for the assurance provider universe to have a very strong independence, provision, so they can, both the actual and appearance of independence, so nobody would ever question sort of the results. And so that where you get to the question of like who's funding the organization and so on, we want it to be sort of just very much obvious to everybody that the work is, fully independent. So I think there's a difference there in terms of the dynamic, but it's absolutely the kind of organization given, they're thinking a lot of these lines as well in terms of, how do you measure risk? How do you do evaluations? It's the kind of organization we want to be collaborating with.
What are examples of IVOs that already exist, or do they need legislation to come first?
I think technically none exist today because there hasn't been like a quote unquote IVO bill. I think there are probably some analogs that exist that are somewhat similar in practice, but not for AI. I know, Andrew, you got any suggestions on something that might look similar?
I've been meaning not to speak up in this one, but I will say Underwriters Lab is the nearest analog of what an IVO is, and has a lot of very similar birth story to it. So every light bulb has a UL stamp on it now. That came because we didn't know about what the dangers of electronic products inside houses would be. Over time, there was a lot of explosions, and then eventually a private side subject matter expertise group like UL came up. They actually got started at the World's Fair to say, like, we actually understand how to make things not blow up in houses. And so if you get our stamp, you'd be correct, and the government has some reliability that this won't show up on it. And of course, even the name Underwriters Lab showed that there was a very close connection with the insurers market. And so we are essentially trying to accelerate the number of ULs in the world that are working in the AI world. And of course, the AI world provides tens of thousands of different contexts for which harm can be committed, not just a light bulb blowing up. And so the examples I would give right now are the potential readers, the transducers, the Averys that are starting to do this work, but none of them have directly called or connected the dots between the work they're doing right now and the potential harm caused by them, and that work would need to be done, or the potential harm that they are addressing, that work would need to be done in order to officially begin an IVO.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.